The night was cold and quiet as a rusty old sedan cruised along a deserted road in the middle of a remote state. Four friends, Jake, Ryan, Emily, and Claire, were returning from a weekend trip, their car packed with leftover snacks and gear. The road cut through a dense forest, the towering trees on either side forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. Jake, sitting in the driver's seat, hummed along to the radio as Emily fiddled with the stations. Ryan leaned against the window half asleep while Claire, seated beside him, scrolled through her phone, though the signal bar showed only a single flickering dot. "This is the worst part of any trip," Claire said with a sigh, tossing her phone into her bag. "No cell service, no lights, just endless trees. What if we get lost?" "We're not lost," Jake replied, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "This road leads straight to the highway, just a few more miles." But as the car rounded a curve, it shuddered violently and the engine sputtered before dying completely. Jake swore under his breath as he steered the car to the shoulder of the road. "What just happened?" Emily asked, sitting up straight. "No idea," Jake said, popping the hood and stepping out into the chilly night air. Ryan and Claire followed, leaving Emily in the car. Jake opened the hood, a small flashlight in hand, but the engine looked fine, at least to his untrained eyes. "It's dead," he said after a few minutes of fumbling. "I don't know what's wrong." "Great," Ryan muttered, running a hand through his hair. "No signal, no cars, and now no engine. What's next?" Emily leaned out of the car window. "There's got to be something we can do. We can't just sit here all night." Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a folded map. "I brought this, just in case. Let's see where we are." Jake took the map and spread it out on the hood, the flashlight barely illuminating its surface. After a few moments, he pointed to a marked line cutting through the forest. "There's a shortcut," he said. "It's a trail that connects this road to the main highway. If we take it, we could get there faster than waiting for someone to drive by." "Through the woods? At night?" Ryan asked, crossing his arms. "That sounds like a horror movie waiting to happen. Do you have a better idea?" Jake shot back. After a brief argument, they agreed to split up. Jake and Ryan would take the shortcut to look for help, while Emily and Claire stayed behind with the car in case someone drove by. Armed with flashlights and hesitant courage, Jake and Ryan stepped into the forest, leaving the others behind. The forest was unnervingly quiet, their footsteps crunching against the undergrowth the only sound. Shadows stretched long and dark between the trees, and their flashlight beams seemed to make the darkness deeper. "You think this trail actually leads anywhere?" Ryan asked, his voice low. Jake glanced over his shoulder. "It has to. The map shows it connects to the main road. Just stay close and keep moving." As they walked, the forest seemed to close in around them. The air grew colder, and an uneasy feeling settled over them, as though they were being watched. Ryan glanced over his shoulder every few steps, unable to shake the sensation. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a hill. At the top, they stopped, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Below, in a small clearing, a fire burned brightly. Around it stood several figures dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes. They moved slowly, almost rhythmically, as though performing some kind of ritual. "What the hell is that?" Ryan whispered, crouching behind a bush. "I don't know," Jake replied, his eyes wide. "But we shouldn't be here. Let's back away slowly." Before they could move, Jake's phone buzzed loudly in his pocket, the vibration shattering the eerie silence. Both of them froze, their eyes darting to the clearing. The figures stopped moving. The fire suddenly went out, plunging the clearing into darkness. Jake and Ryan crouched lower, holding their breaths. "Where did they go?" Ryan whispered, his voice shaking. Jake didn't answer. He grabbed Ryan's arm, his grip tight. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to retreat, a faint rustling sound came from behind them, followed by a low, guttural noise that sent shivers down their spines. "Run," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible, and they did. Jake and Ryan sprinted through the dense forest, their breath ragged and their flashlight beams bouncing wildly across the trees. The guttural noise they'd heard moments ago seemed to follow them, growing louder with every step. "Did you see anything back there?" Ryan gasped, struggling to keep up. "No," Jake replied, his voice tight with fear. "But whatever it is, it's close." The trail beneath them was uneven, roots and rocks jutting out like traps. Ryan stumbled but managed to catch himself, glancing over his shoulder as he ran. The darkness behind them was impenetrable, but the sensation of being pursued was undeniable. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, they came to a small clearing. Jake stopped abruptly, grabbing Ryan's arm. "Wait," he said, his chest heaving. "For what?" Ryan hissed, looking around nervously. Jake held up his hand, signaling for silence. The forest was eerily quiet now. Too quiet. Even the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. The oppressive silence only heightened their fear. "Do you hear that?" Jake whispered. Ryan frowned, listening intently. At first there was nothing, but then, faint and distant, came the sound of whispering. It was soft, almost melodic, but the words were incomprehensible. "It's coming from everywhere," Ryan said, his voice barely audible. Jake nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "We need to move. Staying here isn't safe." They turned to leave the clearing, but before they could step back onto the trail, a flickering light appeared ahead of them. It was the same cold, unnatural glow they had seen earlier at the car. It floated between the trees, moving slowly but deliberately toward them. "Is that a lantern?" Ryan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Doesn't matter," Jake said, pulling him back. "We're not waiting to find out." They darted off the trail, plunging deeper into the forest. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as though the trees themselves were speaking. Jake's flashlight began to flicker, and he smacked it in frustration. "Come on, don't do this now," he muttered. Suddenly, the beam went out completely, leaving them in darkness. Ryan's flashlight still worked, but its beam seemed dimmer than before, as though the forest was swallowing the light. "Jake," Ryan began, but his voice trailed off. "What?" Jake asked, turning to him. Ryan's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed ahead, his hand trembling. Jake followed his gaze and froze. Just a few feet away, standing perfectly still among the trees, was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its body shrouded in tattered dark fabric that blended with the shadows. Its face was obscured, but its head was tilted slightly, as though it were studying them. "Don't move," Jake whispered, barely able to get the words out. The figure didn't move either. It simply stood there, its presence radiating a palpable malice. The whispers around them seemed to intensify, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and dread. "We have to go," Ryan whispered, his voice cracking. Jake nodded slowly. "On 3, 1, 2. Before he could say 3, the figure lurched forward with an unnatural speed, its movement so sudden it was like a blur. Jake and Ryan didn't wait to see what would happen next. They turned and ran as fast as they could, their hearts pounding like drums. Back at the car, Emily and Claire sat in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the dark forest. "How long do we wait before we start to worry?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. Claire glanced at her watch. "It's been almost an hour. Something's wrong." Emily nodded, chewing on her lip. "What if they're lost? Or worse?" Claire didn't answer. She stared out the window, her stomach twisting with unease. The forest was unnervingly still, and the longer they waited, the more oppressive the silence became. Suddenly, Claire's phone buzzed in her lap, startling both of them. "Signal," she said, grabbing it. But as she unlocked the phone, her excitement turned to confusion. It wasn't a call or a text. It was a notification from an unknown app. The message simply read, "They're coming." "What does that mean?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Claire could respond, the car shook violently, as though something had struck it. Both women screamed, clutching each other as they looked around frantically. "What was that?" Emily cried. Claire grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and shined it outside. But there was nothing there. The forest beyond the car was empty, the darkness impenetrable. "Maybe it was an animal," Claire suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. Emily shook her head. "That didn't feel like an animal. It felt like..." She stopped mid-sentence as a faint light appeared in the distance. It floated between the trees, coming closer with each passing second. "Is that Jake and Ryan?" Emily asked, though her voice was filled with doubt. Claire narrowed her eyes, watching the light carefully. As it drew nearer, they realized it wasn't their friends. The glow was cold and unnatural, illuminating nothing around it. Emily reached for the car door. "We can't just stay here, we have to find them." "No," Claire said firmly, grabbing her arm. "Whatever that is, it's not them. We stay here until they come back." The light stopped about 10 feet from the car, hovering in silence. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, plunging them back into darkness. Emily's grip on Claire's arm tightened. "I don't think we're alone." Jake and Ryan burst through the undergrowth, their legs burning and lungs aching as they ran blindly through the dark forest. Every snap of a twig behind them sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through their veins. Whatever was chasing them wasn't human. Its movements were too fast, too erratic, and its presence seemed to distort the air around them. Ryan stumbled, nearly falling, but Jake grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. "Don't stop! We're almost there!" "Almost where?" Ryan gasped, his flashlight flickering in his hand. "We don't even know where we are." Jake didn't answer. He didn't know either, but stopping wasn't an option. The whispers returned, louder this time, their eerie, disjointed words wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. As they crested a small hill, the forest seemed to shift. The trees were closer together now, their trunks gnarled and twisted as if in agony. The path they'd been following was gone, replaced by an uneven stretch of ground littered with strange symbols carved into the dirt. "What is this?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Jake shined his flashlight around, revealing more symbols etched into the surrounding trees. They were crude, almost primitive, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. "We need to keep moving," Jake said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. But before they could take another step, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. A low, guttural sound echoed through the forest, not from behind them this time, but from all around. The air grew colder, their breaths visible in the dim light of the flashlight. Suddenly the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then they saw it. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural. Its face was obscured by a tattered hood, but its eyes were glowing, piercing through the darkness with an otherworldly light. It didn't walk, it glided, its movements smooth and unnatural, as though it wasn't bound by the laws of nature. Jake and Ryan froze, their bodies paralyzed with fear. The figure raised one skeletal hand, pointing directly at them. "Run," Jake whispered, though his legs refused to move. The figure let out a sound, a low guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. That was enough to break their paralysis. They turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, their only goal now to escape the forest. Back at the car, Emily and Claire huddled together, their eyes darting between the surrounding trees. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the car's metal frame, as though the forest itself were pressing in on them. "I can't take this anymore," Emily said, her voice cracking. "We have to find them." Claire shook her head. "Number. We wait here. If they come back, we'll be gone, and they'll be stranded." Emily started to argue, but the sound of footsteps outside the car silenced her. They both turned toward the window, their breath catching in their throats. A figure stood just outside the car, its silhouette barely visible in the faint moonlight. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Jake?" Claire called hesitantly, though she knew it wasn't him. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if curious, but didn't respond. Emily grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window. The beam illuminated the figure fully, and they both gasped. It wasn't human. Its body was gaunt and twisted, its face pale and featureless, except for two hollow black voids where its eyes should have been. Emily screamed, dropping the flashlight as the figure pressed a bony hand against the window. "Start the car," she yelled, but Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "The engine's dead, remember?" Before they could react, The figure dissolved into a cloud of shadow, seeping into the car through the cracks in the doors and windows. The air grew freezing, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling their heads with incomprehensible words. Jake and Ryan finally broke through the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the road where they'd left the car. But the car was gone. Where is it? Jake asked, his voice hoarse. Ryan looked around frantically. They couldn't have just left. It was broken down. Before they could make sense of what had happened, the forest behind them began to stir. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the ground, and the whispers grew louder, angrier. "We can't stay here," Jake said, grabbing Ryan's arm. As they turned to run, headlights appeared in the distance. A pickup truck approached, its engine rumbling loudly. Jake and Ryan waved their arms frantically, stepping into the road to flag it down. The truck skidded to a stop, and an older man leaned out the window. "What the hell are you two doing out here?" "Please help us," Jake said. "There's something in the woods. Our friends are missing." The man's expression darkened. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. "This place, it's not safe at night." "What do you mean?" Ryan asked, but the man simply gestured for them to get in. "Get in. Now," he said. Jake and Ryan didn't hesitate. They climbed into the truck, and the man drove off, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. As they left the forest behind, Jake glanced back one last time. For a brief moment, he thought he saw figures standing at the edge of the trees, their glowing eyes watching as the truck disappeared into the night. The gas station on Route 79 wasn't exactly the busiest place in the world. Tucked away on a lonely stretch of highway, it catered mostly to truckers, night owls, and the occasional traveler desperate for coffee and directions. Chris Parker had worked there for about 6 months, usually pulling the graveyard shift. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills. Plus, Chris liked the quiet. But there was a reason why no one wanted the night shift. Strange things happened at the Route 79 gas station. Chris's first encounter with the strange had happened on his third night. He was restocking the cooler when he heard the chime of the front door. "Be right there," he called out, closing the cooler door and hurrying to the counter. But the station was empty. The door swayed slightly, as though it had just closed, and a faint chill lingered in the air. Chris stepped outside, scanning the parking lot. It was deserted. The only sound, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. "Must have been the wind," he muttered, though the air had been still. Shrugging it off, he returned to the counter and resumed his routine. But from that night on, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Over the weeks, the odd occurrences piled up. Items would shift on the shelves when no one was there. The security cameras would glitch, showing static or fleeting shadows. And then there were the noises, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Chris tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just his imagination or the quirks of an old building. But one night, something happened that he couldn't explain away. It was just after 2 a.m. when a car pulled into the station. It was an old, beat-up sedan, its headlights flickering as it rolled to a stop by Pump 3. A man stepped out, dressed in a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. Chris watched from the counter as the man stood motionless by the pump, not bothering to fill his tank. Instead, he turned his head slowly, as if sensing Chris's gaze. Though the man's face was still hidden in shadow, Chris felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The man raised a hand and pointed directly at the station. Chris's breath caught in his throat. "Can I help you?" he called out, his voice trembling. The man didn't respond. He simply turned, climbed back into his car, and drove off into the night. When Chris checked the security footage later, the car wasn't there. Things only got worse after that. One particularly quiet night, Chris was sweeping the floor when the power went out. The station was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the emergency lights. "Great," he muttered, fumbling for his flashlight. As he clicked it on, the beam illuminated the aisles, casting long, eerie shadows. Then he heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the back storage room. "Hello?" he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Gripping the flashlight tightly, Chris made his way to the storage room. The door was ajar, swinging slightly, as though pushed by an unseen hand. He stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just boxes of snacks and cleaning supplies. But then the tapping stopped, replaced by a soft, shuffling sound. Chris swung the flashlight toward the sound and froze. In the corner of the room stood a figure, its back turned to him. It was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally thin, and its head tilted at an odd angle. "Hey!" Chris shouted, though he wasn't sure why. The figure didn't move. Chris backed out of the room, slamming the door shut and locking it. He didn't stay to investigate. Grabbing his keys, he bolted out of the station and into his car, driving home as fast as he could. When Chris returned the next night, the storage room was empty. He considered quitting, but something compelled him to stay. Curiosity, maybe, or a sense of duty. The final straw came a week later. It was a quiet night, and Chris was scrolling through his phone when the radio crackled to life. "Help me," a faint voice whispered. Chris stared at the radio, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the station lights flickered, and the chime of the front door echoed through the empty building. Chris turned toward the door, but no one was there. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure stood just outside the window, its face pressed against the glass. It was the man from Pump 3, his hat still obscuring his face. But this time, Chris could see something beneath the brim, empty eye sockets that seemed to suck the light from the room. The man raised a hand and tapped on the glass, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Chris didn't wait to see what happened next. He grabbed his keys and ran, leaving the station behind for good. Chris never returned to Route 79. A week later, the station shut down, the owner citing unexplainable incidents as the reason. Chris tried to move on, but the memories lingered. Every now and then, he would hear the faint chime of a door or the tapping of fingers on glass. And sometimes, late at night, he would see a pair of headlights in his rearview mirror, flickering just like the ones from that beat-up sedan.